Dear colleagues, welcome to 8th webinar of İKOMOS Aykuç. We have two more distinguished speakers between us, and I would like to invite Dr. Chris Underwood to have the opening speech of the 8th webinar. Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Hakan. Wherever anyone is, welcome to the 8th edition of the İKOMOS Aykuç webinar chain. As Hakan has already said, we've got two distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce Dragomir Garbov, who is unable to join us today. Dragomir holds a BA, a Master's and a PhD in Archaeology from the New Bulgarian University in Sofia, Bulgaria, where he is now an adjunct professor. Between 2013 and 2017, he worked in the Center for Underwater Archaeology in Sosopol, Ministry of Culture of Bulgaria, where he is now an associate researcher. He is also a maritime archaeologist with Comber Consultants, Sydney, Australia. Dragomir's academic interests are focused on wooden shipbuilding and seafaring in the golden age of sail, maritime connectivity, and the coastal and maritime human landscapes of the Western Black Sea. Dragomir is a core member of the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project and directed the underwater excavations of the St. Nicholas Bay shipwreck in Shemoranets in Bulgaria in 2015. He holds a number of recreational and commercial diving licenses. Hakan, I think you need to start Dragomir's presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we are going to start the presentation of the
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to give a talk at the İKOMOS Aykuç webinar. I wish to thank the organizers, Dr. Chris Underwood and Professor Hakan Önes, for providing me with this opportunity to present some of Bulgaria's fascinating maritime cultural heritage. I also wish to thank all of you for your understanding. My talk is unfortunately pre-recorded as it is currently 2 o'clock in the morning in Australia, where I currently live. I am happy to respond to any queries or comments on this talk by email, and my address will be provided at the end of the presentation. Before I begin, I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I reside on, the Awabakal people of Newcastle, New South Wales. My talk today will be devoted to an aspect of the maritime cultural heritage and archaeology of the Western Black Sea. The Golden Age of Sail is a period that for this part of the world can be chronologically positioned from the last quarter of the 18th to the end of the 19th century, a period that has produced entire categories of fascinating and important archaeological and cultural heritage monuments, which are traditionally understudied and generally underrepresented in heritage dissemination as compared to the traditionally promoted and immensely rich prehistoric, ancient, and medieval heritage of our region. The talk is structured in several parts. I will first share a few thoughts on the Black Sea and the underwater cultural heritage management in Bulgaria. I will then introduce the historical period in question and present some of the principal archaeological and underwater cultural heritage sites and projects. I will discuss some new evidence that is now emerging, and I will share some concluding remarks on the meanings and significance of the sites and projects. It is a vast topic, and I can only present a fraction of it in the allocated time. So let's begin. The Black Sea is located in the southeast of Europe on the boundary between Europe and Asia. It is an enclosed basin that is connected to the Mediterranean and the World Ocean via the Bosporus Strait, the Marmara Sea, and the Dardanelles. It is very deep for its size, at 2,200 meters of water. The Black Sea is considered enclosed mainly due to the shallow depth of the Bosporus Strait, only 35 meters deep as opposed to the 2,200 meters of the Black Sea. This also determines the water composition of the Black Sea basin, which is its most extraordinary feature. Due to the immense freshwater recharge, as opposed to the shallow depth of the Bosporus, the Black Sea water column is defined by two very different layers of water. From 0 to 150 meters, there is a brackish oxygenated layer of water. And from 150 down to 2,200 meters, there is a saline anoxic layer of water. The Black Sea abyss is one of the most extraordinary environments on our planet and contributes to an outstanding preservation of archaeological sites and materials, some of which we are going to review in this talk. Speaking of underwater archaeology, this discipline has deep roots on the Western Black Sea and is currently celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. It was 1961 as the first underwater archaeological expedition was undertaken on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast near Cape Maslinos. Throughout the years, maritime archaeology in Bulgaria has been spearheaded by trailblazing scientists like Lyuba Marinova Ognenova, whom we can see with her dive team in Nesebar on the upper photograph, and Christina Angelova, whom we can see here sharing some thoughts with the great George Bass on the second photograph. 1978 saw the establishment of the Center for Underwater Archaeology of the Bulgarian Ministry of Culture, the oldest institution of its kind on this side of the Iron Curtain and the first institute of this type within the Black Sea Basin. Since the 1970s, extensive work has been undertaken on submerged prehistoric settlements on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. This was the main focus of the Center for Underwater Archaeology. Currently, the CUA is Bulgaria's National Cultural Heritage Institute, employed in the management and protection of underwater cultural heritage. Due to Christina Angelova's tireless efforts, Bulgaria can take pride in being the second country in the world after Panama and the first country in Europe to ratify the UNESCO Convention on the Underwater Cultural Heritage of 2001. The Bulgarian Cultural Heritage Act is in line with the convention, and so are all underwater archaeological and cultural heritage works as undertaken by the Center for Underwater Archaeology. Now today, I will be talking about the maritime archaeology and cultural heritage of the Western Black Sea from the 18th and 19th century. This is an immensely interesting historical period determined by the total globalization of the world's maritime trade and the heyday of commercial sail, which occurred in the 1850s and 1860s. This is also the time when the Black Sea was fully integrated in the global maritime world of the long 19th century. Now let's take a look at the historical background to this conversation. You see, only a few years after the fall of Constantinople on the 29th of May 1453, the Ottomans were able to capture the entire circumference of the Black Sea. For the first time in its history, the Black Sea became a mare nostrum, an internal sea owned by a single state, the Ottoman Empire. During the 16th century, the Ottomans gradually pushed out most foreign seafarers from the basin, and in the 1590s, the Black Sea was effectively off limits to non-Ottoman seafarers and merchants. What followed is a period of nearly 200 years of nearly complete isolation, where the Black Sea maritime culture and seafaring practice developed in their own way. The waters of the sea were plied by traditional sailing ships who were mostly engaged in supplying the vast markets of the metropolis of Constantinople with various agricultural and market goods. Inter-regional maritime contacts beyond the Bosporus Strait were minimal. This began to change in the late 18th century as the rapidly growing Russian Empire pushed south in a desperate need to secure warm ports and gain access to the Mediterranean. Following a series of wars, Russia finally gained permanent access to the Black Sea under Catherine the Great in 1774. During the last quarter of the 18th and first quarter of the 19th century, the Black Sea was finally reopened to the rest of the world. Over the next few decades, intensive foreign trade erupted as the Black Sea entered the globalized and industrializing world. By the 1850s and 60s, Western Black Sea ports were annually visited by thousands of foreign vessels exporting mostly agricultural products such as the valuable high-quality Black Sea wheat and importing industrial products and general market goods. The maritime landscape and local maritime culture changed dramatically. Now herein lies the problem. How do we study the cultural implications of the golden age of sail and its influence on local communities? Although the period in question is very recent, due to the complex political history of the region in the late 19th and early 20th century, endemic sources on the maritime culture, seafaring practice, shipbuilding, etc. are very scarce, almost completely missing. Ethnic movements to and from the Western Black Sea region in the early 20th century have also left large gaps in local ethnographies and local traditions. Due to the scarcity of other sources, archaeology seems to provide the most powerful tools for studying the golden age of sail on the Western Black Sea. In the recent years, significant amounts of information have been gathered that begin to share a new light on this period of maritime globalization. So let's review some of the principal sites. The first site under discussion is also the first shipwreck ever to be excavated in Bulgarian waters, the Kitten shipwreck, discovered in 1983 during harbor construction in 8 meters of water in the harbor of Kitten in the southern Bulgarian Black Sea coast. The site was test excavated by the CUA between 1983 and 1986 and fully excavated in a joint project between the Center for Underwater Archaeology and the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in the USA in the early 2000s. It was recorded, reconstructed, and published by Professor Krumbachev from the University of Connecticut. The Kitten shipwreck represents the remains of a circa 23-meter-long traditional Ottoman sailing merchantman from the very end of the 18th and very beginning of the 19th century, most likely dating prior to 1804. It was a double-ended vessel with a robust construction built almost entirely of oak. There was no trace of the shortages of timber typical for European shipbuilding during this period. When studying the Kitten shipwreck's design and construction, Krumbachev revealed clear links to the Adriatic and Venetian shipbuilding traditions of the 15th and 16th centuries, and was even able to reconstruct the mezzaluna and mezzarola used to design the ship. We can see that the Kitten ship could be considered archaic by all its contemporary standards. Archaic for the 19th century was also the rigging of the Kitten ship, represented by a raking mast and a large lateen sail. The archaeological evidence showed that the ship had running shrouds, due to the toggles that we can see in this part of the slide here, and most interestingly, all the ropes on board were found to be made of reed mace. The material culture retained on the Kitten shipwreck reflected its owners and crew. The ship was manned by Orthodox Christians, as evidenced by a wooden icon that was discovered aboard, who had connections with the Dardanelles area, but also to Varna in the present-day northern Bulgarian Black Sea coast, as well as to the interior of present-day Bulgaria. The ship would also have had a master who had some knowledge of celestial navigation, as evidenced by a sextant mirror. The Kitten shipwreck can be seen as the embodiment of the early stages of integration of Black Sea maritime communities in the globalized world of the long 19th century. A traditionally built sailing merchantman, she was a local vessel engaged in commerce between the Black Sea, Constantinople, and possibly the Eastern Mediterranean. It is a protected archaeological site and remains in situ in the Kitten South Bay. The second shipwreck to be archaeologically excavated in the Bulgarian portion of the Black Sea was the St. Nicholas Bay ship, discovered by the CUA in 2014 and excavated in the summer of 2015 by a team led by yours truly. It lies in 4 meters of water in the harbor of Chernomorets, approximately 20 kilometers southeast of Burgas. The first article on the archaeology of the St. Nicholas Bay ship is coming out in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology in the next couple of weeks. The St. Nicholas Bay shipwreck represents the remains of a circa 36-meter-long European wooden sailing merchantman of the late 19th century and is the diametrical opposite of the Kitten shipwreck. Two portions of a large double-frame hull was studied with remains of the vessel's useful ballast of refractory bricks in the center of the archaeological site. The St. Nicholas Bay ship was built after a professional design with industrialized construction methods. The specifics of her construction, such as the use of the metric system of measurement for designing the ship, as well as the prolific use of brass spikes for the plank on frame construction, showed that she was probably built in Mediterranean Europe under a certain degree of French and English influence. A lucky find of several brass spikes with production stamps indicated an association with Austria-Hungary and the famous shipyard Stabilimento Tecnico Triestino from Trieste. A connection to Austria-Hungary was later confirmed through dendrological and archival evidence. In fact, an archival study undertaken in 2020 by this author contributed to the identification of the St. Nicholas Bay ship and the reconstruction of her history. The SNBS, as we now refer to it, was a barkentine built in 1865 in Fiume, Austria-Hungary, present-day Rijeka in Croatia, which at the time of her wrecking sailed under Italian flag and the name Alleanza. It was reported as wrecked near Burgas on the 9th of November 1875. During her career, the barkentine Alleanza sailed between the Black Sea, the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, the British Isles, and France, and crossed the Atlantic to Buenos Aires on 2 occasions. This archaeological site embodies the final integration of the Black Sea within the globalized maritime world of the long 19th century. It is also a protected archaeological site and remains in situ in the Bay of St. Nicholas. Only a month after the completion of the St. Nicholas Bay shipwreck excavations, together with our colleagues from the University of Southampton, the Maris Center of the Södertörn University in Stockholm, and the University of Connecticut, we embarked on the now well-known Black Sea Maritime Archaeology project. This project was funded by the Expeditions and Education Foundation on behalf of the Julia and Hans Rausing Trust and aimed at studying sea level rise in the Black Sea and reconstruct the inundated prehistoric landscapes along the present-day Bulgarian shelf. We also found many wrecks. Relying on state-of-art technology such as the unique Surveyor ROV as developed by MMT, as well as the Supporter and Schilling work-class ROVs in 2016 and 17, the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project recorded 65 wooden sailing ships on the Bulgarian Black Sea shelf, on the continental slope, and in the Black Sea abyssal zone in Bulgarian waters. All of these were fantastically preserved by the anoxic conditions of the Black Sea. Some of these wrecks were absolutely spectacular and first of a kind, making global headlines. On this slide, we can see some renders of some of our famous discoveries, such as an ancient Greek vessel from the late 5th, early 4th century, a 10th century Eastern Mediterranean sailing ship, probably Byzantine origin, a 13th century Adriatic, probably Venetian or Ragusan round ship, 17th century Ottoman ship with fantastic carvings. As these have seen quite a lot of attention lately, I chose to direct my talk to some of our underdogs. You see, 10 wrecks of the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology portfolio were found to be of European sailing ships from the late 18th and 19th centuries, which pertain to the topic of my current talk. Unfortunately, I have just enough time to show you 2 of these. The first one is a Mediterranean bombard, a ketch-rigged vessel about 22 meters long that was discovered at a depth of 155 meters just at the turn of the Bulgarian continental slope. It is a fantastically preserved vessel. The site was recorded through archaeological geophysics and high-resolution photogrammetry, allowing for reasonably precise measurements on the hull. Just note the size of this mast. A vertical orthomosaic of the archaeological sites shows some of its distinctive features. Please note the gun ports and deadeyes on the port side of the vessel. A very interesting windlass comprising rope on the port side drum and chain on the starboard side drum, marking the transition from anchor cables to anchor chains and giving us an archaeological date in the first half of the 19th century. 4 anchors recorded on site, a bilge pump, a capstan with chain, and the ship's stern post with the rudder gudgeon still attached to it. A front view orthomosaic shows some of the features of the rig. Note the mainmast is rigged polacar fashion to the top gallant, a characteristic feature of Mediterranean shipbuilding to allow the fast dropping of yards on deck in case of a sudden squall, a feature that we will see later on in this talk. Unfortunately, none of the yards of this vessel were present besides the jib boom and gaff jaw at the mizzen. Interpretation, we need to note that vessels such as this were the workhorses of the Western Mediterranean in the early 19th century. Hundreds of them were built and used most notably in the regions of Provence and Liguria. One of these has been very well documented in the historical record, the merchant vessel L'Avalon de Dieu, first drawn by Antoine Roux of Marseille around 1816, and then by his son François Roux. Later, her lines were traced by Admiral François Edmond du Paris, the founder of the French National Maritime Museum in Paris. The hull of this vessel is of nearly identical shape and proportion to the Black Sea example. And an even closer parallel has been recorded by another artist from Marseille, the famous Jean Beaujean, whose depiction of a bombard is nearly identical to the Black Sea example. Note the identical rigging on the mainmast, where both vessels have one main tree and a fitted topgallant mast. The number of gun ports is identical in both vessels, and this lithograph comes from 1801. We can therefore conclude that in our case we're dealing with either a Provençal or a Ligurian vessel from the first quarter of the 19th century. The second vessel I'd like to briefly discuss is a schooner-rigged galliot from the mid-19th century. The vessel was discovered at a depth of 90 meters on the Bulgarian Black Sea shelf and is testimony to the fact that even at such relatively shallow depth, preservation within the Black Sea is already extraordinary. The masts of this vessel are still standing proud over 30 meters above the seabed. As the previous vessel, this vessel was also recorded using state-of-the-art geophysical and photogrammetric techniques, allowing for a very precise three-dimensional model of the archaeological site. A vertical orthomosaic shows us the principal features of this archaeological site. Please note that all spars and yards are present, including several spare spars on deck that she seems to be carrying. This seems to be an extra mast here. A very characteristic bow for Dutch galleots of the mid-19th century. As evidence for dating, please also note the hand winch abaft the ship's foremast, which suggests a date after the 1830s. Also, a very interesting hybrid Armstrong pattern, so-called windlass, which is a combination of a pump action mechanism with an anachronistic spindle-style windlass and must date after 1835. We can see the remains of a ship's boat on the starboard side. Also remains of the typical deck house for Dutch galleots, and we can see a view to the stern cabin where it seems that one of the portholes has been boarded up for bad weather. The comparison of specific features of this vessel, especially the very typical bow and the schooner rig, permit us to seek its origins in northern Holland and Friesland, and particularly in the region of Groningen in the 1850s. On the top left, we can see a builder's model from Groningen and the ship's model, and beneath it, a ship's portrait from Venice, possibly by an artist of the Lutzow clan, that show near analogues of the vessel. A similar Kof galliot was also drawn by Admiral Edmond de Paris. In fact, we may have been successful in identifying that vessel. Based on a news report from the New Rotterdam Gazette from Christmas Day 1858. It mentions a ship named Katharina with a Captain Van de Waal as lost in the Black Sea around 55 miles from the northern entrance of the Bosporus. A cross-reference with the Dutch Register of Shipping for the same year shows that Katharina was of identical proportions to the Black Sea wreck. Furthermore, Katharina seemed to have belonged to the township of Veendam, which is right next to Groningen. A 55 miles radius from the northern entrance to the Bosporus shows that the Black Sea map wreck is just at its cusp, so there is a high likelihood for a positive identification of this vessel. Okay, so we saw the sea, but what was happening on shore? What were the local responses to the newly arriving European sailing ships and seafaring practices? Or what were the modalities of Black Sea maritime globalization? Although we have some anecdotal historical sources mentioning that European-style sailing ships were starting to be built along the western coast of the Black Sea in the late 1820s and early 1830s, we still have no direct material evidence for that. So can such evidence be identified? Well, we are now beginning to identify such evidence, and most of it seems to revolve around the coastal towns of Nesebar, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Sozopol, both located in the Gulf of Burgas on its northern and southern tips. The first category of this evidence is represented by the remarkable maritime graffiti as preserved on the walls of the medieval and post-medieval churches of the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Nesebar. These are represented by hundreds of crude drawings of ships executed by local residents in the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th centuries. While some of these have been recorded in the past, a project for exhaustive recording was recently completed by the Center for Underwater Archaeology and the Museum of Ancient Nesebar as part of my colleague Zdravka Georgieva's PhD research in the University of Southampton, depicted on the bottom left as recording the graffiti. While most maritime graffiti in Nesebar show local traditional craft and boats, some represent foreign modern vessels, such as this bark here, for example, or the hybrid square-rigged vessel that we can see on the bottom right corner, which seems to represent a traditional local hull with a modern square brig rig. Please note this vessel as we might refer to it once again a bit later. And the second completely new category of sources that we just started working on since last November is represented by a series of votive Orthodox Christian icons now kept in the museums of Nesebar and Varna. These were usually donated to churches by maritime families and are found to contain accurate depiction of sailing ships. For example, this icon of Hagia Galina, a maritime saint, which dates to 1809. It was donated by a man named Zotis Reisis, Zotis the seafarer, in the name of their late father Ioannis or John Saratumoglu. On the left-hand side, in the bottom register, we can see a scene of the martyrdom of the saint and the ship very similar, I'd say, to the Kitten shipwreck. And on the right-hand side, we see an even more remarkable description. The inscription reads, Saint Nicholas at the helm and Hagia Galina's icon in the water save the ship. So this icon records a traditional maritime cultural practice previously unknown in the local area, where dangerous seas can be calmed down through prayer and dipping an icon into the sea. What is even more significant, however, is the quality of execution of the sailing ship, which most likely represents the vessel owned by Zotis the seafarer and is accurate enough to allow to be cross-referenced with two Western depictions of Black Sea sailing vessels from the 19th century. And the second icon, which is even more interesting. It is exactly 30 years younger than the Hagia Galina icon from Nesebar and was an altar icon from the St. Nicholas Church in Varna. It is signed by a painter named Dimitrios from Sozopol, so most likely, as the Hagia Galina icon, this icon also comes from the Gulf of Burgas and was donated to a church by a currently unknown corporations of maritime merchants. We see that 30 years later, the ships depicted on this icon are completely different from the ones on the previous one. On the left-hand side, we see a very interesting vessel comprising a traditional Black Sea hull with a curved stem and a transom stern, a vessel known as Gagalı in Turkish, Gagalis in Greek, or Gagalia in Bulgarian after its curved stem. Remember the graffito from Nesebar? Isn't that the exact same ship? We also see the same vessel in a harbor scene from Poti, Georgia, painted by Seger and Desarno, which is just 5 years younger than the icon, dating to 1834. So now we're seeing evidence by Western travelers corroborated by local sources. By the 1830s, Black Sea vessels were already receiving Western-style rigs. But how about the second vessel? This is a typical Mediterranean pole-masted brigantine, same philosophy as rigging, as our French or Ligurian bombard. In fact, we can find the French analogue of this vessel in the Prince of Jean Bougeant. The interesting question here is, was this a vessel that was purchased from the Mediterranean and owned on the Black Sea? Or was this a vessel even built on the Western Black Sea? Now, while we can't answer these questions at the moment, it seems that with more and more evidence available, we're beginning to see an archaeological pattern for the very first time. So before 1804, we have the Kitten shipwreck. By 1809, we have the Hagia Galina icon showing us very similar traditional vessels to the one from Kitten. By the 1820s, international shipping is increasing on the Western Black Sea, and by the 1830s, square rig vessels are being purchased by, but also locally built for Black Sea merchants. In the latter half of the century, these tendencies increase even further. So while we are just at the beginning of research just now, we can see that it is an exciting time as priceless evidence is being identified on this topic on a daily basis. The maritime globalization of the Western Black Sea is a potent topic which is just now beginning to reveal its full potential. It further emphasizes the value of 18th and 19th century tangible cultural evidence for the study of the rich maritime narratives of the Western Black Sea. So thank you very much for your attention. I also wish to express my thanks to the Center for Underwater Archaeology, the National Archaeological Institute with Museum in Sofia, Bulgaria, the Museum of Ancient Nesebar, Archaeological Museum of Varna, and all the members of the Black Sea Map Project, particularly Dr. Mladen Prachov, Director of the CUA, Todor Marvakov, Director of the Ancient Nesebar Museum, Professor Jonathan Adams from the CMA Southampton, Dr. Krumba from the University of Connecticut, Dr. Kalin Dimitrov from the National Archaeological Institute with Museum of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and Zdravka Georgieva from the Museum of Ancient Nesebar. Thank you. Please refer any questions to my email address, which is d.garbov@gmail.com.
Yes, this is the end of the presentation of Dragomir. Chris, would you like to say something on this presentation?
Well, for the sake of the recording, I'd like to record my thanks to Dragomir for such a clear and illustrative presentation of the maritime world within the Western Black Sea. And just to add a personal comment is that for many, many years, I think many of us in maritime archaeology has recognized the huge and breadth of potential of maritime archaeology within the Black Sea and the surroundings. And I think Dragomir's presentation has just whetted my appetite for more. And of course, I'm familiar with the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, which I hope will continue and reveal more and more maritime treasures. Thank you, Hakan. I'll pass it over to you and Mladen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And yes, I completely agree with you. It was very nice presentation. Now, the second speaker is our colleagues from Croatia, Mladen Pesic. He is graduated archaeology and geography at the University of Zadar in 2007 and began his career as a conservator and restorer of underwater archaeological material at the Croatian Conservation Institute. Since 2005, involved in many underwater archaeological field works. Until today, he is licensed SSI diving control specialist and was leader of a number of underwater archaeological research in Croatia. Since 2011, employed at the International Center for Underwater Archaeology in Zadar, which is UNESCO Category 2 Center, as head of the Department of Documentation and Education, where he was responsible for conducting underwater archaeology courses and currently working as the director. He is also a member of the Croatian delegation in third, sixth, and seventh meeting of state parties to the UNESCO 2001 convention. Yes, Mladen, welcome again.
Thank you, Hakan. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the nice introduction. As you said, it is maybe a little bit long, but you can shorten it next time. I'm happy to be here, happy to have a presentation for you, and happy to be, let's say, a new member of ICOMOS ICUCH from this year. And I would like to thank this to you, Hakan, and to Chris for your effort and for possibility to let me join you, and of course all the other members that willingly took me in your crew, let's say like this. So I can start the presentation. I would also maybe like to comment on Dragos' presentation. It was really interesting. Lots of different and interesting projects that are taking in Bulgaria, and I'm happy that we can see this in his presentation, and hopefully this will continue even in the next year. Not only Black Sea Map project, but the other projects that are really interesting and happening in Bulgaria. Okay. Oh, sorry. Do you see it like me or?
It is coming. You can have double click to enter full screen mode.
Just a moment, because something. I see it in a strange way, sorry.
No problem at all, we have time.
Because my screen is up, sorry. What do you see? Do you see a normal presentation or, sorry, because.
You know, you already did. There is a share screen side, must be in green.
Yes, but I don't see it normal. I see it just part of the screen, so I'm not sure what do you see. This is why. Sorry.
We don't see it.
And now is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Good, thank you. Okay, for the introduction, my presentation is going to be about protection of underwater cultural heritage in Croatia and some challenges that we are facing currently in Croatia. As you might know, Croatia is a country that is one of the countries leading in underwater archaeology, I would say, in Mediterranean, along with the other countries. Of course, this depends on our natural environment where we are situated. But as long as the protection of underwater cultural heritage, we also face many challenges, and I will try to share some of them with you, and maybe to see your experience, or do you have similar experience like we do. You know where Croatia is situated is in the southern part of Europe, on the end of the Mediterranean. Our Adriatic Sea is a part of we share it with Italy, and the Croatian territorial sea consists of some 31,000 square kilometers. Sorry, it has 1,244 islands, islets, rocks, and reefs. So our coast is really developed in all along. Only coastal border of Croatia, which is connected to the sea, is 1,778 kilometers. But if we include all the islands, the coastal border is more than 6,000 kilometers. So this is a vast area which is not easy to cover with surveying or protection or taking care of underwater archaeology. Of course, during history, Croatian Adriatic Sea was really important for the seafarers because of several reasons. Some of them are safe ports. Between all of these islands, we have different bays and different areas where boats or ships could dock during the night and hide from the different environmental constraints. Sea currents are also really important, especially for the ancient sailors. They use them, and the sea currents in Adriatic were coming from the eastern part or Croatian part to the north and coming back to the Italian side. So they usually used these sea currents for the seafaring on the eastern Adriatic coast. Of course, the favorable winds, especially in the sailing periods or in period of the sailing vessels, was one of the most important things. And of course, Croatian, you can see it in this lower slide, that favorable winds that were used by the seafarers during different parts of the year were really something that seafarers could use to. But of course, winds are not always favorable. As you can see on the right part, even today, these southern winds, which we call Jugo, or northeast winds, which is really strong, we call it Bura, they are really the winds that can cause many, many problems even today. So you can see that even in these modern times, they can destroy ships, they can tear the woods from the ground, and of course the waves and the wind can cause many problems for the seafarers. But this didn't stop the even ancient seafarers to use this maritime transportation route through the eastern Adriatic coast. So basically, we have in Adriatic even evidences from seafaring from early Neolithic period, especially shown by the obsidian stone, which is not common in Eastern Adriatic, but we find it on different islands, and then that we can know that the seafarers are using the boats to travel between the different parts of the Adriatic. Import of Daunian and Attic pottery from Italian southern part, which date from 8th to the 5th century, is also a common find in many Liburnian or domestic tribes that inhabited Croatian part of the Adriatic. Greek colonization from 4th and 3rd century. There are many archaeological evidences from this period. And you can see on the map that the routes that were coming to the Adriatic were really vivid, especially in the southern part where we have many Greek colonies. And in little bit later period, transportation of Greco-Italian amphoras from 3rd to the 2nd century BC, and transportation of Lambolia II, famous amphoras from the north part, show us that transportation was going in both directions, to the north and to the south on the Adriatic. This historical background caused that protection and excavation and research of underwater archaeology in Croatia began really early in the 1960s, and this was the period when it became evident that underwater archaeological sites were really very much threatened by robbery and devastation. Even in this period, that means more than 60 years ago, the divers or the small number of underwater archaeologists saw that it was necessary to adopt proper legislation in order to protect underwater cultural heritage, but also to try to document most of the things that could be documented in order to be saved for the next generation. You can see in the pictures from here that in some of the sites they used, let's say, technologies that were not common in this period. They use metal grids underwater and these columns for the photogrammetry, even in the 1960s and the 70s. And we are happy that we have this documentation because most of these sites, unfortunately, are not in this condition as they were in this 1960s and 70s. Based on the possibilities that were present, the obligation to research and protect these sites were undertaken by research teams operated from different coastal cities in Croatia, mostly from Pula, Rijeka, Split, Šibenik, Zadar, and Zagreb, because Zagreb as capital had the establishment of the Ministry of Culture, which was main institute to lead and finance the protection. All of these researchers continued during the 70s, 80s, and since 1990s when Croatia got its independence, Ministry of Culture and Media was in charge for the managing and funding of all the underwater research and protection of cultural heritage. That means all the financing and all the plans were coming from the Ministry of Culture and Media from Zagreb. Different institutions were conducting this research and protection. One of them, and first of them, was Croatian Conservation Institute, which had a department for underwater archaeology in Zagreb, still existing, where our colleagues work. And in this beginning of the 90s, they were leading all the research and all the protection of underwater cultural heritage in Croatia. During the years, different archaeological museums from Zadar, Pula, Split, Dubrovnik, and Šibenik, but also smaller museums from Umag, Hvar, and Lošinj headed smaller teams of underwater archaeologists who did some protection and research of underwater cultural heritage. Of course, universities joined the similar patterns. So University of Zadar has also underwater archaeologists that still even today conduct underwater archaeology and protection. My institute, or International Center for Underwater Archaeology, where I work, was founded 2007, and from 2009 we are UNESCO second category center, which also not provides protection and research of underwater archaeology, but also different courses and different organization of different conferences for the dealing with underwater archaeology, and of course promoting the UNESCO convention. As Drago said, Bulgaria was the first country in Europe to ratify the convention, and I'm happy to say that Croatia was following Bulgaria as the third country in the world to ratify the convention in 2004. In these pictures, you can see some of the sites that were excavated during 80s and 90s. Some of them are really important. For example, you will see also after the shipwreck from Sautat, who consists more than 1,200 amphoras, or shipwrecks from Hvar, which consist more than 600 amphoras, most of them from 4th century, which was really a vivid period in sailing of the Adriatic. When talking about Croatian underwater cultural heritage, we cannot miss a few of the crucial finds that were found during the historical periods, during the last 60 years, let's say. So one of them is Korundura Croatica. It's typical or traditional Croatian boat ship from 11th and 12th century, from the age of Croatian emperors. Two of them were found in Nin, city near Zadar, which was kept crown city of the Croatian kings. And these were the only two ships that were found. They were famous because of also from the historical sources when Constantine Porphyrogenet mentions these ships. Today, these ships are restored, one of them completely and one of them partially, and they are exhibited in the Archaeological Museum in Zadar or in the department in Nin. You can see here also some of the models that were done recently of these ships. Also, there are several replicas that can be used for sailing, and these ships are, let's say, presented in a proper way to the public. Nowadays, after 50 years of conservation, 40 or 50 years of conservation, they are in shape that our institution is trying to reconserve them. That means that we are trying to make new conservation of the ships, because they are now after 40, 50 years in not so good condition, let's say. The second find that we can mention, and you also probably heard about Gnalic shipwreck, which was also found during 1960s, excavated during 1970s, famous ship that was sailing from the Venetian, from Venice to the Istanbul, carrying the huge number of glass vessels, but also different inventory for the Sultan harem that was burned there. These excavations are even happening today, because University of Zadar is taking new excavations of the site. Of course, Apoxiomenos, the Greek statue Greek copy of the Greek statue from the first century BC, that was found near Lošinj island, Veloriule, in 1996, was one of the crucial finds that, let's say, made underwater archaeology popular again in Croatia. After this find, which now is exhibited in Lošinj Museum, and it's really nice museum that you can see. But the important thing was that this find basically forced or woke underwater archaeology in Croatia, and this was one of the reasons why our center eventually was also formed. When I'm talking about my institution, I cannot miss that we are also doing the research from different finds from different sites. We just can shortly see a few of them. I won't take it will take too much time to speak too much about them, but you can see Babuja shipwreck from the 5th century that we have been excavating and protecting, shipwrecks Veruda or Uljeva from different periods, but also new modern, let's say, last year's excavations from Šolta shipwreck that my colleague is working in. Also, the excavations or protection of the medieval or 16th century bridge in Darda, which was built by Sultan Suleiman. Parallel to the protection of underwater cultural heritage, Croatian laws and regulation that was concerned activities directed at underwater cultural heritage were produced, let's say. One of the most important is law of the protection and the preservation of cultural property, which also includes underwater archaeology. There are different laws also that protect cultural heritage. You can see some of them here, but also regulation on archaeological research, which tells us how we should do archaeological research and underwater archaeological research. One of the important regulations is regulations on the procedures and methods of issuing permits for underwater activities in inland sea waters and the territorial sea of the Republic of Croatia, protected as cultural property. Long name, and basically these regulations are dealing about the regulations of the sites that it is possible to be seen by the tourists and public or local communities, or different publics. Today in Croatia there are more than 600 registered underwater sites. Diving in these registered sites, protected sites and areas is regulated by the special regulations, and basically it's forbidden to dive on these sites without special license of the Ministry of Culture. Even for us, for underwater archaeologists, if we want to go to these sites, we have to have special permission each time when we are going to see these sites. At the moment, 184 sites and areas are permanently protected in this register of cultural goods, and from all of them, only 34 sites or areas in Croatia is possible to be visited by the leading of the diving clubs. Of course, in these sites, the diving is regulated by the different permissions, prohibitions, obligations for the concessionaires. Concessionaires are basically the diving clubs that pay concession to the state. They get 5-year concession, and they have obligation to protect and to preserve the underwater cultural heritage or site where they are taking the tourists. So basically, this is a model where Croatian state, let's say, is protecting different sites, but also is in one way is some of the funds, let's say, that Croatia invested in protection is coming back to the state budget. These protected areas with tourist access are different sites. Some of them you can see here. One of the famous is, of course, Baron Gauch, which sank in 1914 near Rovinj. It's in 40 meters depth, so it's 30 to 40 meters depth, so it's relatively approachable to the tourists. We call it Croatian Titanic, and it is most visited underwater cultural heritage site in Croatia. There are some of the sites that are in deeper waters. For example, St. Istvan shipwreck from the 1918 Austro-Hungarian shipwreck, which is only approachable to the technical divers, approximately at 66 meters depth. But also some different ships that you can see here, like Lina in eastern part. And not only modern shipwrecks are visited by the tourists, we have different shipwrecks even from the ancient period. You can see one of the newly discovered just a few years ago, shipwreck in Pag Island. It would not be possible to mention protected areas in Croatia if we don't mention metal cages, which were since 1990s one of the pioneer, let's say, protection model that was used in Croatia. There should be safe method of way of protection the sites, but you will see afterwards that also we are dealing with some problems even with these sites that are basically protected with cage. You can see some of them here. One of them is on the Savtat shipwreck that I mentioned before, which covers more than 1,200 amphoras. And basically they are available for the access for the tourists, and inside it's possible only to the outdoors personnel or underwater archaeologists or us to get inside, but tourists cannot go inside. They only can document and take pictures from the outside, from this small to these holes, let's say, on the nets, like this. These methods, although they are good methods, but they are relatively expensive to be set, and this is why only 8 of them on really important sites were set. As we said, they have certain level of self-sustaining, because part of the money that are earned by the diving clubs comes to the state budget. But the problem is because all of these sites are not so approachable, and there are not so many diving clubs that take tourists there. So some of them, or basically just one of them, is really touristically exposed, but most of them are just protected in this way. We are mentioning tourism in Croatia, and we have to say that it makes really 18% of gross national product in Croatia, and it's really important branch, especially tourism that is connected by the sea, because most of the tourists come to the sea, and really interest for diving is constantly increasing. As I said, there are 115 diving clubs spread all over Croatia, and maybe just 20 of them have concessions for different underwater cultural heritage. Annually, as we see here, number of divers can come up to 100,000, which is a number which is really impressive for our community. But this is not a number that can access all of the tourists to the diving sites. So basically, there are new ideas how to promote underwater cultural heritage to the wider public. One of the ideas was coming from this site in Pag shipwreck that was relatively newly discovered, and it was decided not to be protected with cage, but the efforts are made to be protected in this way, with hydrophone which detects movements, cameras that also detect movements and alert authorities, but also cameras that film underwater and are presented in diving club, where the people who are not diving on the site can see what's happening underwater. Different ways to promote underwater cultural heritage were also made within different European projects. For example, here in Zadar area, in Barbir site where we are working, the bathymetry models were made from the different underwater structures or the piers, and according to this, different animations were set in order to promote it to the wider public. In some areas, as here in Visual Bay near Pula, where Croatian Conservation Institute was working, the efforts were made to make snorkeling tours in different Roman villa sites. But even today, with the technology, we're trying to promote this underwater cultural heritage to the wider public through YouTube or different medias that can be covered by the films. Okay, so challenges in protection that we can see here. We are going to talk just shortly about human factors. There are many challenges that we are facing for underwater cultural heritage, and I'm not going to tell too much about fisheries, trawling, or construction works, or even environmental factor. The thing is that I would like to mention is the human factor in this moment. In Croatia, in most of the restaurants or cafes or in different areas where they serve drinks or food, it is not uncommon fact that you will see many underwater cultural heritage exposed in a different way, as you see it here. So the thing is that it is forbidden. And as you will see it according to the Croatian law, it is punishable, but still this is happening, and this is something that we are facing each day. Some of these collections are private collections that could be registered to the state. As you can see it here, some of the collection in different areas are presented and protected in a way that it is a private collection that is that state protects, but it's possible to expose it in private, let's say, restaurants or or hotels. The thing is that this cultural heritage is not always it doesn't have good conditions to be presented or to be protected, because in these conditions where you can see it without constant use, a constant level of the moisture or constant level of the sorry, constant level of the protection, it is not possible to maintain this for a long period. But these private collections are not so problematic if they are registered by the state. Even today, in in some of the Croatian research, some Croatian markets, people are trying to sell the cultural heritage. You can see it here that even today, these are pictures from the last several years that people are trying to sell in different prices, mostly amphoras, which are of course the leitmotif of the underwater cultural heritage. Some of them are preserved properly, but some of them can be sold here. As you can see, this one is selling for 70 euros because it's broken. And it's broken because it did not pass all the process of the sterilization and protection of the goods. Of course, police is doing the job, and some of these looters are caught during last years, but this is not enough. And as much as we see, constantly the underwater cultural heritage from the sea bottom is disappearing. As you said, the Croatia legally protects and preserves the cultural property. You can see here that some of the articles from the law of the protection and preservation of cultural heritage is that it states that for the persons who put in direct danger of damage or destruction of cultural properties, or who does not stop the execution of works when encounters the archaeological site, or performs archaeological and underwater archaeological excavations without legal provisions, or performs or organizes underwater activities, they could be punished with different punishments. Most of them, according to this law, is the punishment for the money. And for the individuals, it's really not such a big punishment, because as you can see, it could be up to 2,000 euros. And the amphoras that we saw before are selling each one for 2,000 euros. So people are using these models to even today to act not according to the law. Of course, it also states that the persons who does not declare a good or uses cultural property contrary to the established purposes, or makes a replica, or even performs restoration and conservation works without professional title, these people also can be punished by the money punishment. But Croatia has a criminal code also protects the cultural property, and according to this law, people can get 6 months to 5 years for different ways if they're caught in damaging or destroying or export and transfer of the cultural goods, but even for conservation and restoration of the archaeological and underwater archaeological finds if they don't have the license. So basically, the criminal code and the law of protection protects the cultural heritage, but even today we know that, and we can see that this is still happening, and efforts that we are trying to make and for the protection of underwater cultural heritage are not always satisfying, let's say. Croatia has also control of the sea.
Mladen, are we going to finish, because our duration is already finished?
Yes, I can finish in 2-3 minutes if you have time or no.
Okay, 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I will skip this slide. I just want to say that the last thing that last steal or illicit trade that we saw is one of the cage protected sites in Vlaška Mala. You can see it here from site was discovered 2004 and consists of 100 amphoras. But during 2019, we went to the site, and inside of the cage we have noticed that 40 amphoras from this 100 are missing. This is something that is we call it organized crime, and of course police actions were started for this, but unfortunately the robbers did not get stole. So basically I could finish with this. I just wanted to say that even for now, after 20 years of UNESCO convention and different laws that we are obeying, we are still facing the threats of underwater archaeological heritage and the looting that's still happening. Okay, I will stop now if there's no time, but I will be open, of course, for all the questions on the mail or here.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, Mladen. Yes, we have learned many things about the Croatian underwater archaeology, and probably Athena is trying to ask a question. Athena, you can ask, or you can also write. Up to you.
Thank you, Hakan. I don't have any particular questions for Mladen, but it's really exciting to see all the work that's been going on. I've been working in Montenegro a bit, and we're just finishing the publication now. So we're really looking forward to seeing how the data from the southeastern Adriatic really compares to the amount of data that you're producing in Croatia. It's really fantastic to see. So thank you for this really encompassing lecture.
Thank you, Athena.
Thank you, Athena. Is there any other question? Okay, many of our colleagues like your presentation, as far as I see from the text. And thank you very much again, Mladen, and welcome to ICUCH, by the way. This is the first presentation in ICUCH by you, and it was very nice. And this is end of the 8th webinar of ICOMOS ICUCH. And Chris, would you like to say something to close?
Thank you, Hakan, and thank you, Athena. I think between you, you've probably taken quite a few things that I was about to say. But what I would like to say is Mladen, like Dragomir, just showed us the richness of the underwater cultural heritage landscape, not only in the Black Sea, but in the Adriatic. And they're just fantastic places. But also, Mladen particularly reminded us of the threats and the challenges that we continue to face. And this is in spite of, I know Croatia has been unbelievably active in protective measures, with the cages, with everything that goes with that. And despite all of that, you know, there are still challenges. And these are lessons for all of us to take on board and fight even harder for better protection, better measures, better resources, more resources to protect our irreplaceable underwater cultural heritage from all of these parts of the world. Amazing locations and such potential for tourism and associated research. Amazing. Thank you, Mladen. And again, welcome to ICUCH.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hakan, for nice words.
Okay, end of the presentation, and thank you very much for all of you to listen to these important and nice presentations. And have a great day, have a good morning, and have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.